Your Locked On Blackhawks, your daily podcast on the Chicago Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, Blackhawks fans? Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Jack Bushman. Quick reminder to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube, all of which is 100% free, will not cost you anything, and is the best way to show support and help me reach my next goal of 3,000 subscribers. All right, happy Wednesday, everyone. Again, thank you all for joining me on another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, your one-stop shop for all things Chicago Blackhawks. Despite the final score being 2-1 last night, it was not a pretty performance out of our Blackhawks to begin their 3-game West Coast road trip. They were pretty dominated at even strength all night long. Utah led 36-22 in shots on goal, but if you do some deeper digging and go and look at the analytics, Utah held a 69-19 advantage in terms of shot attempts, a 40-6 advantage in scoring chances at even strength as well, including a 15-1 lead in the third period. Cannot win a hockey game like that as the Blackhawks continue to struggle out of the Four Nations face-off. They actually opened the scoring for the second consecutive game. The first period's never really the problem for this team. Blackhawks opened up the scoring on the power play with a goal from Seth Jones, who, stick with me here for a minute, Blackhawks fans, believe me, we'll have a lot more on him. Nice power play goal out of Seth, showing patience and the shooting ability, maybe helping that draft stock go up a little bit in the process to put the Blackhawks ahead 1-0. But yeah, that wound up being all the scoring that they could muster up. Utah actually didn't get on the board until the final minute of the second period, thanks to yet another outstanding performance out of Arvid Soderblom, who was doing everything he could to keep his team in the game. Clayton Keller winds up tying the score in the final minute of the middle frame. That gave Utah all the momentum going into the third period, and then Blackhawks basically couldn't even maintain possession in that final frame. Lawson Krause roofs a backhander to put Utah ahead for good. That winds up being the game winner, and the Blackhawks never really could get anything sustained in the offensive zone in the final minutes to try and tie this game up. They wind up falling 2-1 for their third consecutive loss out of the Four Nations face-off, and they've been outscored 12-4 in the process. Not going to get any easier either, Blackhawks fans, is next up on the schedule is the Vegas Golden Knights, who currently lead the Pacific Division, and I'll be talking more about the Pacific Division and the standings as we get down to the final stretch of the season in segment 3 to close out today's episode. Good time to remind you all that everything is always time-coded down in the description, so you can easily jump around to whatever point you want in every single episode. Biggest takeaway I have from last night's loss to the Utah Hockey Club, though, Blackhawks fans, undoubtedly was Seth Jones' post-game comments. Seth Jones clearly has had enough of not only the losing, but I think the way the Blackhawks are going about their losses. Like I mentioned, you go and just look at the box score 2-1, you think, oh, that's a hard-fought road performance out of this Blackhawks team who's at the bottom of the standings. No. They were throttled at even strength, in particular in that third period when the game was still in the balance, but you could definitely see Utah being the hungrier team, which, does make sense considering they're fighting for their playoff lives. But this is the National Hockey League. You got to have more respect for yourself and your organization, your teammates, than what the Blackhawks have right now. And that's kind of what Seth Jones said in his post-game comments. Like I mentioned, he did not mince his words following this lopsided loss where he scored the only goal of the game for the Blackhawks and played over 25 minutes once again. Here's what Jones had to say in his interview. Quote, "We're the exact same team right now as we were game 1. It's pretty evident out there. We haven't made any strides to be a better, more simple hockey team, and it shows. We had no business being in that game last night," close quote. And the biggest takeaway that I have from that comment is clearly Seth Jones is fed up. He's sick of all the losing, the way the Blackhawks, like I just mentioned, have been going about the losing, not making any strides whatsoever, at least in a multi-game basis, right? They can have those performances where they beat anyone. We've seen it time and time again throughout the course of the season, but there's absolutely no consistency. I believe they have 1-2 game winning streak all season long and might have only had one last year as well. And Seth has been a part of that. So I certainly understand his frustrations. And honestly, like, nothing he said there is untrue. Seth Jones is speaking the truth. And I don't even really mind him sharing this type of comment, considering the situation that he's in and how long he's been suffering these types of losses. I just think it's really interesting, the timing of these types of quotes. It's clear that Seth Jones, if he could leave the Blackhawks organization right here, right now, he would. But unfortunately, there's too many complications involved in that, and I'm still not even quite sure if the Blackhawks would benefit from moving him prior to this year's trade deadline. And even though he was this outspoken, and it's probably the harshest comments he's had about his own team since joining on with the Blackhawks, again, with only 24 games left in the season, you don't want this happening, but it's tolerable for the final 24 games when losing isn't the worst thing in the world for this organization. I know it's not exactly what us fans want to hear. We want more competitive hockey games, but don't think that's going to be the case to close out the 2024-2025 campaign. But to me, this just emphasizes what I've talked about when breaking down Seth Jones trade rumors on the show so far. It absolutely has to happen before the start of next season, because Seth clearly doesn't want to be here. You don't want him in that headspace, and being a veteran leader who's, as long as he's on the Blackhawks, he's going to be playing top pairing minutes. You just want to avoid that situation completely. So yeah, Seth Jones basically as good as gone, you would have to think, after these types of comments. Not surprising considering where things have been trending. But if the Blackhawks can get a favorable deal done before March 7th, yeah, I think they'd like to do that. I'm just not exactly sure that's in the cards. It's something that's easier said than done, but 100% Seth Jones has to be traded before the offseason comes to a close. Tough night for the Chicago Blackhawks. And again, I understand Seth Jones' frustrations. There was even one moment, I mentioned this on Twitter, one moment in the game where Seth Jones was stuck out on the ice for like a 2+ minute shift, and his teammates weren't really doing him any favors to dump the puck in the offensive zone and help get him off the ice. And the broadcast panned over to him on the bench, just kind of laughing after that scenario. Based on his post-game comments, that was absolutely a sarcastic laugh. Like, I can't even get off the ice on this freaking team. They can't hold the puck long enough for me to even get to the bench. So I get Seth Jones' frustrations, and again, he's not wrong, but man, tough times to be a Chicago Blackhawks fan. Seems like it's tough time to be a player on the Blackhawks as well. Connor Bedard, last night, there was a scene on the broadcast of him as well, just kind of staring out into the abyss in the penalty box, and I'm sure he's as frustrated as he's ever been in his hockey career. He's never really dealt with this much losing. He doesn't really have a lot of help alongside him. The line rotations and the mashup, I don't think, is doing him any favors either. You can just really tell this kid is reaching a little bit of a boiling point, and that's definitely unfortunate and not a situation we wanted to find ourselves in, where there's no really patching this up. I feel like in the final 24 games, you just kind of hope things go better down the stretch. And it's just really clear that both on the coaching front, Anders Sorensen is just not an NHL head coach. He does not have the solutions for this team. And also, general manager Kyle Davidson did not do a good enough job of giving this Blackhawks coaching staff, whether it was Sorensen or Luke Richardson, enough to work with. Last night, Lukas Reichel, by the way, was healthy scratched, which I expected, but I still find annoying. Who was playing the center ice position in the bottom six for the Blackhawks last night? I know Jason Dickinson's out, but it was Colton Dach, who is not a center. I don't even think he's played center at all for the Rockford Ice Hogs, not going to be a center at the NHL level, and Philip Kurashev, who's never really been a center at the NHL level. Just a clear lack of putting together a capable roster out of Kyle Davidson, and also a lack of a good coach behind the bench to kind of push the right buttons. Those have been clear symptoms of this Blackhawks team all season long, regardless of who's been behind the bench, and just needs to be more success more successful decisions made in the free agent market and in terms of who's going to be the head coach, the next head coach of the Blackhawks in the offseason. It is going to be tough watching these final 24 games of the year, Blackhawks fans. Power to you if you're right there alongside me, bearing through it. There is everything I have from yet another sloppy loss out of the Blackhawks, 3 in a row now following the Four Nations face-off. Coming up in just a moment here, I'll talk more about Lukas Reichel and get into some of the latest trade whispers we're hearing on him ahead of the NHL trade deadline. But first, real quick, I got to talk to you all about the fine folks over at Indeed. You just realized your business needed to hire someone like yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? It's easy. Just use Indeed. Because when it comes to hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites, because Indeed sponsored jobs puts your post at the top of the page and helps you reach the right candidates faster. They make sure your post is seen by the right candidates right now. And you can skip all of those unnecessary questions and steps, because now you can speed up your hiring process with a $75 sponsored job credit by just going to Indeed.com/lockedon. Again, that's Indeed.com/lockedon right now. And make sure to support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this very podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring Indeed is all you need. Segment 2 with Lukas Reichel being healthy scratched last night and a lack of serious usage basically all season long. As I've mentioned, him not being a Kyle Davidson draft pick, I don't really think helps in this either. You got to wonder if the front office has at least considered moving Lukas Reichel at this point in time to maybe try and recoup an asset while you can, and also to try to give him another opportunity elsewhere. Now, me personally, I would be very wary about trading Lukas Reichel just because of the usage. And I know there hasn't been a lot of consistency from Reichel each of the last 2 seasons, but I still really feel like neither of the 2 coaches the Blackhawks have had behind their bench have done him any favors. And maybe I'm just scarred by what we've seen from Dylan Strome and how much success he's having with the Washington Capitals, and Gustav Forsling, the amazing job he's done on the back end for the Florida Panthers to help them win a Stanley Cup last year. I don't think Lukas Reichel is ever going to be held in the same breath as those 2 players, but as a kid who's only going to turn 23 years old in May, we ultimately still can't fully put our finger down and say this is exactly what type of player Lukas Reichel is going to be. Maybe he's not going to be in the same type of conversation with those 2 guys, but again, with the type of season this has been for the Blackhawks this year, the type of season it was last year, I just really do not understand not giving Lukas Reichel a larger role, even if you think, okay, maybe he hasn't deserved it, and maybe the coaching staff doesn't believe the way he goes about his business is set up to have success with this team long-term. And maybe because, like I just mentioned, he's not a general manager Kyle Davidson draft pick, they don't really care ultimately if Lukas Reichel doesn't pan out, because they have other guys they're hopeful that will have top 6 upside. But to me, quitting on Lukas Reichel at this point would be absolutely foolish because of, yes, while it has been from only time to time and very consistently, we've seen a lot of good things out of Lukas Reichel. I continue to say on the show, he's one of the few players on this team who can lug the mail through the neutral zone and into the offensive zone. I mean, seriously, how many puck carriers do the Blackhawks have on this team? It's Connor Bedard. It's Frank Nazar. It's from time to time Ryan Donato, mostly just because of hard work and effort, not because of his skill. Ilya Mikheyev has good wheels. Teuvo Teravainen's kind of too undersized and doesn't really play big boy hockey enough to consistently carry the puck into the offensive zone. It's like Frank Nazar, Connor Bedard, Ilya Mikheyev, Lukas Reichel, and Seth Jones. Those are like the puck carriers on the Blackhawks, and Reichel doesn't get put in a position where his puck carrying, I think, can help this team in the long term. And even when he does get opportunities up in the lineup, it's only for like a period or 2. Why have we not seen Lukas Reichel at all with Connor Bedard? And I'm not saying here on the podcast it's absolutely going to work and Lukas Reichel is going to knock it out of the park in that situation. But again, we just don't really know what he'd look like with Bedard because he doesn't get a huge sample size along with him. So considering those things, considering the skating ability and the offensive IQ, I know it's not really been on full display, but I do think Reichel has good playmaking ability, especially off of the rush and in transition. Like, those are skill sets you want to see out of a 22-year-old, even if it is still taking a little bit longer than you want for him to put it all together and become the finished product. I would be very skeptical of trading Lukas Reichel for those reasons. However, my opinion on this matter and on Reichel doesn't really matter, as there at least seems to be some steam at this point surrounding a possible Lukas Reichel trade, as Scott Powers of The Athletic, one of the best on the Blackhawks beat. If you're not following Scott on X or subscribe to The Athletic, what are you doing? Great news and updates from them. But in a recent piece dropped by Scott Powers yesterday, where he talked about some Lukas Reichel trade rumors, Powers said, quote, Lukas Reichel seemed as if he was going to be a part of the Blackhawks' future not too long ago. Now, wouldn't be surprising if Reichel's time with the Blackhawks comes to an end. It's been a repeated cycle for Reichel over the last few seasons. He plays well for a bit, then he's inconsistent, then he's a healthy scratch, and then he shows signs again of his upside, and it all repeats itself. I don't think the Blackhawks are necessarily shopping Reichel, but I also don't believe they'd turn down a trade offer for him. And I agree with that statement from Scott Powers. I don't think Kyle Davidson is on the phone calling other general managers and being like, look, you want Lukas Reichel? We're trying to get rid of this guy. But I think if other teams were to call up Kyle Davidson and kick the tires on Lukas Reichel a little bit, I don't think he would be hanging up that phone. I would think he'd be very interested in those calls, again, to see what type of asset he could maybe recoup for a former 2020 first-round pick, and to also give Lukas Reichel an opportunity elsewhere. But I wouldn't go down that path. Again, maybe it's just my scar tissue that I have from other players, but I wouldn't be surprised considering what we've seen from Reichel, again, as only a 22-year-old in his first few NHL seasons, with not a lot of help on him, with a bad Blackhawks team, probably some bad coaches handling the situation as well, right? Like, that's a kid that I wouldn't trade, especially when, again, he's only going to turn 23 in May. He signed on at $1.2 million, right? Like, it's not a big cap hit where, like, if it doesn't work out, you're going to be super bummed about it, or it's really going to hurt this team whatsoever financially. I know it's been spotty and in between in terms of the productions, with only 16 points, 5 goals, and 11 assists in 50 games so far this year. Never close in the last 2 seasons to what we saw from him in the 2022-2023 campaign, where he got called up and it finally seemed like he put it all together and had 15 points in the final 23 games of the season. One thing I want to mention there, that was when Lukas Reichel was playing wing. Lukas Reichel has been playing center for a majority of the season, and Luke Richardson's style, I don't think it benefited this Blackhawks team whatsoever offensively, and I don't think it benefited a guy with a skill set like Lukas Reichel. So with the Blackhawks very, very likely going to be hiring a new head coach, I mean, bring back Anders Sorensen to be the NHL head coach, I don't think that's in the cards whatsoever. I give him credit for stepping into a real tough situation, but he just doesn't have the answers, Sway. So with the Blackhawks very likely going to be bringing in a new head coach next year, I would like to give Lukas Reichel one more year, which he's already under contract for, with a new head coach who maybe can do a better job in utilizing him. That's the way that I would go about it. But let me know your thoughts on what you think the Blackhawks should do with Lukas Reichel. Do you think they should be shopping him at this year's trade deadline or potentially in the summer? Or would you, like me, want to give him one more crack next season in the final year of his contract before we ultimately make that decision? But there is the latest I have on the Lukas Reichel trade front. And by the way, Blackhawks fans, I'll be having a beefy Blackhawks trade deadline preview involving Ryan Donato, Lukas Reichel, Seth Jones, Pat Maroon, all the Blackhawks players potentially on the trade block, dropping this Friday. Be on the lookout for that. Coming up in just a moment before I wrap up today's episode, still want to take a look at the Pacific Division and talk about who I think is going to qualify for the Stanley Cup Playoffs. Back here on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Again, just wanted to say thank you all to everyone for making Locked On Blackhawks your very first listen here to start off your day. For your second listen, make sure to go and check out the Locked On NHL podcast, bringing you the daily league-wide stories that matter with local coverage from Locked On. You can easily find Locked On NHL right now on YouTube or wherever you may be listening to your podcasts. Segment 3, like I did yesterday with the NHL's Central Division, go and check out that show if you haven't done so already to get my full thoughts on the current Central Division standings and how I think it's going to shape up when the regular season comes to a close. Today, I'm going to be doing the same thing for the Pacific Division and kind of go through a playoff preview of the entire Western Conference. Early on next week, I'll be starting to take a look at the Eastern Conference and dive into who I think is going to make it out there. But taking a look at the NHL's Western Conference, sitting atop the Pacific, I don't know why I said taking a look at the NHL's Western Conference. Taking a look at the NHL's Pacific Division, currently sitting atop the Pacific is team the Blackhawks are going to be playing in their next contest tomorrow night in the second game of their current 3-game road trip. That would be the Vegas Golden Knights. So a real tough stretch for the Blackhawks out of the Four Nations face-off, starting things off with a road game against Columbus, who's fighting for their playoff lives, trying to secure one of the final wild card spots out east. Then they're taking on the Toronto Maple Leafs, who are battling for the top spot in the Atlantic Division. Last night out in Utah, playing the Hockey Club is there, a couple points out of a playoff spot right now. And then the Vegas Golden Knights on Thursday trying to secure the Pacific Division title. Vegas has a 2-point cushion at the top of the Pacific Division standings right now. They are 34-18-6 through 58 games, giving them 74 points. Right behind them, though, is Connor McJesus, Leon Draisaitl, and the Edmonton Oilers, 34-20-4 through their opening 54 games, just 2 points back of Vegas for the top spot. The Los Angeles Kings currently in third. They're 31-17-7 through 55 games, giving them 68 points. The Calgary Flames currently hold the final wild card playoff spot out west. They're 28-21-8 through 57 games with 64 points, 4 points back of the Los Angeles Kings for the third playoff spot in the division. Then the Vancouver Canucks have had a lot of turmoil in the opening 59 games of their season. They're 26-20-11, through 57 games, giving them 63 points, 1 point back of Calgary for the final playoff spot, 5 points back of the Los Angeles Kings for the third seed in the Pacific Division. And then we get to the bottom feeders, the Anaheim Ducks. I guess they're not technically a bottom feeder like the other two are. The Ducks are 25-25-7 through 57 games. The Hawks will be closing out their road trip on Saturday night in Anaheim. The Ducks have 57 points. Very unlikely they're going to be chasing down a Stanley Cup playoff spot in their final 25 contests. However, a very noteworthy season for them in terms of the strides they've made in their rebuild. Really would have loved for the Blackhawks to be 25-25-7 through 57 contests this year. Then in the 7th spot is the Seattle Kraken, who are 25-31-4 through 60 games, giving them 54 points. And then we have the San Jose Sharks, dead last in the NHL standings, but number 1 in the Tankathon standings, just ahead, however you want to phrase it, of the Chicago Blackhawks. They're 15-36-8 through 59 games now, giving them 38 points, still 3 points clear of the Blackhawks. As far as how I see things shaking out in the Pacific Division, I ultimately expect the Vegas Golden Knights to go and hold off the number 1 spot. I do think the Edmonton Oilers will give them a good run, but now that the Oilers have been to a Stanley Cup final and they've kind of had some playoff success and experience with this bunch, what I find, at least this is what's gone on in recent history, yes, Edmonton would love to have home ice advantage. Yes, they would love to win the division, but that's not the end goal. The end goal is winning the Stanley Cup. And now because they've had playoff success together, I believe that they probably have, whether they talk about this, I don't believe so, but it's that underlying feeling that, hey, we know we just need to get in, go in with some good momentum, and anything can happen in the Stanley Cup playoffs. I don't know if that number 1 spot in the division is necessarily written on the board like it is for them to get back to the Stanley Cup and win it this year. So I think Vegas is going to finish with the number 1 spot. Edmonton is going to be right behind them, though, at number 2. And not to be boring, Blackhawks fans, but I think what the division is right now in the Pacific is how it's going to shake out in the top 3 when it's all said and done in early April. The Los Angeles Kings, even though the Calgary Flames are coming with a good push, the Kings are 4 points ahead and still have 2 games in hand as well. So I think that's a good enough cushion to get them through in the 3 spot the rest of the way. Calgary, I really do think has a very good chance of getting that final wild card spot. I mentioned when talking about the Central Division standings yesterday, I think the Utah Hockey Club is that young and fearless team that doesn't really know any better and could get on a good run down the stretch of the season. If it's not Utah, I think Calgary is going to get that top spot. But I'm giving the edge right now to Calgary with a 2-game advantage. They have 3 points in hand over the Utah Hockey Club, but it's going to be a very entertaining race for those final playoff spots out west between Colorado, Minnesota, Calgary, Utah, St. Louis. I wouldn't throw out of the mix yet at this point in time. I'll be having, I'm sure, another couple of standings updates before the final days of the regular season to help build up on the drama. But that's going to take care of today's episode of Locked On Blackhawks, everyone. Again, thank you all for joining me on the show. Be sure to go and subscribe to Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube and follow Locked On Blackhawks for free wherever you may be listening to your podcast. That way you can check out the latest episode as soon as it becomes available each and every day. Until next time, everyone, enjoy the rest of your Wednesdays. I'll see you next time on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.